In part 1 of this series on the origins of the crisis in the church, I spoke of the influence of communism, the infiltration of the church by communists, and their link to the Bay Area lifestyle activists who now seem to run the church with impunity. In part 2, I spoke of the infiltration of the church by her more ancient enemy, the Freemasons, and their goal of destroying the church from within. Both groups are linked together. In part 3, the topic is the heresy of modernism, which can be thought of as the jet fuel that runs the machine of Freemasonry and communism. The concept of modernism was described by Popes Leo XIII and Pius X in numerous encyclicals. Both saintly popes saw a threat that had already, by the late 19th century, wormed its way deep into the heart of the Catholic Church, infecting the thoughts, morals, and teachings of the Church in many ways that put the salvation of souls at risk. It may sound strange to some that the Church was once principally concerned with the salvation of souls instead of global warming, refugees, and the economic policies of developing nations. But in the not-too-distant past, the Church spoke forcefully about the salvation of souls and fought stridently and uncompromisingly against all threats against the faith. In an encyclical that can be described as both dense and astonishing, St. Pius X penned a nuclear assault against modernism in the Catholic Church. Pasceni Dominici Gregis describes a betrayal of the Church from within. In the opening chapters, Pius X describes various attempts at using kindness to win over these foes of the Church. His efforts were in vain, in much the same way that the efforts of the current regime in Rome's efforts to win over the love of the world by changing many of the Church's remaining troublesome teachings will themselves be in vain. Pius X saw that it would be a crime to remain silent on modernism, saying it was his duty to expose before the whole Church in their true colors those men who assumed this bad disguise. Modernism is a poison, and the duty of the shepherd is to warn against the poison. Modernism is a philosophy that is anti-intellectual and agnostic. We see this today whenever we see a pope, any pope, attending ecumenical conferences with non-Christian religions and implying or outright saying that those other religions are pathways to the truth. Pius X found the modernist doctrines scattered and disjointed, creating an illusion of questioning and uncertainty. In reality, Pius X saw that the theories of modernism hang together and form a system, which he proceeded to group together. He does this in a deep and wide-reaching manner that examines the modernist as a philosopher, as a believer, a theologian, a critic, apologist, and a reformer. As a way of introduction, modernism is a naturalist system of thought that reduces religion to individual experience. It is relativistic, and it teaches in one age what was condemned in a previous age. That is modernism in a nutshell, but let's dive a bit deeper. The initial philosophic assumption of modernism undermines the rest of the system. The philosophy contradicts the dictates of the First Vatican Council, which states that the one true God, our Creator, can be known by the light of human reason, by means of the things that are made. Modernism denies this by saying that human reason is confined entirely within human experience. That is, what can be perceived by the senses, and so it cannot lift itself up to God. This makes away altogether with natural theology, the motives of credibility, and all external revelation. This undermines the very system of natural law that the Church has used as a worldview frame of reference for centuries. And if a worldview based on pure experiences sounds familiar, it should. It's a form of relativism, condemned by the Church as recently as during the pontificate of Pope Benedict XVI. This view can be called agnostic, or even atheistic. Science supersedes the natural law and traditional modes of understanding creation because the scientific method prizes controlled experiences. God and all that is divine or miraculous or supernatural must be excluded from science and from history, especially biblical history, in both the Old and New Testaments. Thus, we see the Church endorsing evolution, global warming, and reducing Adam and Eve to a metaphor governed by a real fall of man. If the philosophical worldview of the modernists is purely relative, purely experiential, then religion exists in man. It is what modernists call immanence. We find God in the religious sentiment, a sentiment rising from the subconscious, a movement of the heart. This is what the modernist calls faith. Compare this to the Catholic doctrine on faith. Faith is an act of the intellect at the command of the will, which assents to God's revelation, because God is truth itself. This is impossible for the modernist due to his agnosticism. Faith is reduced to sentimentality that leads to religious experience. Revelation is reduced to an experience of emotion, to individual truth. This religious sentiment is the source of all religion, all kinds of religion, including the Catholic religion. There is no external revelation. Where does that leave the Bible? The Bible is an expression of experiences, the religious sentimental experiences of the patriarchs, of the prophets, of Christ, who was reduced to the greatest prophet, kind of like in Islam, but a man only, a man of exceptional religious sentiment that leads to world-changing individual experience. From his religious sentiment, as a plant from a germ, the church in some way emanates. Also, its dogmas and its sacraments are all for the experience of the believer. Thus, if your time in the confessional seems more like a therapy session instead of a period of paternal correction and absolution, you can thank modernism. The dogmas of modernism are ruled by reason and science. They reflect on the religious sentiment in a combination with reason. The sacraments are symbolic. They're an external sign of the religion used as a means to propagate the religion, and they are based in pure emotion. To be honest, I've done an inadequate job of describing modernism thus far. At best, I provided a bird's-eye view of the heresy of modernism. The main takeaway must be this. Modernism is a system that sacrifices human intellect rightly understood for pure human sentiment. It is a system that prizes individual experience, individual emotion, over reason, even when reason is used for the modernist purposes. The reduction of faith and human life to emotion destroys the credibility of the modernists. One such example of the destruction of their credibility is this blasphemy. We hear of a Christ of faith versus a Christ of history, as if there were two different Christs, and the implication being that the Christ of faith is a fiction. This divorces faith from philosophy, science, and history, leading to the absurd situation where the modernist is left as a philosopher or as a historian or a critic, but is agnostic about religion while simultaneously being able to preach Christianity with what sounds like conviction. If this sounds like cultural Catholicism to you, you would be onto something. Modernism makes this absurdly possible by confining human knowledge to the knowable world, and faith to the unknowable world. Faith and reason are not only divorced in the traditional sense of faith and reason, they never meet in the first place. There is no conflict between them. So one could hold that Jesus in the world of reality was only a man, but in the world of faith, one could pray to him as a god. When the Second Vatican Council opened the windows of the Church to the world, the proposed renewal of religion would have adapted it to the modern world. This adaptation required a purely emotional, relativized religion that denied Christ at the most fundamental level. Pope Pius X wrote the following after a lengthier, more intellectual exposition of this heresy than I am capable of delivering. To quote Pius X, "How can anybody who surveys the whole system be surprised that we should define it as a synthesis of all heresies? Were one to attempt to collect together all the errors that have been broached against the faith and to concentrate the sap and substance of them all into one, he could not better succeed as the modernists have done. Nay, they have done more than this, for their system means the destruction, not of the Catholic religion alone, but of all religions." Pius X follows this with the following points. Sentiment is understood as taking away the intelligence of man, who is already inclined to follow senses, resulting in man becoming enslaved to his senses. Common sense remains and contradicts modernism, as common sense tells us that sentiment, emotion, hinders the search for truth. Sentiment will in fact deliver your intellect when searching for the truth because the truth makes hard demands of us. If you need any examples of how sentiment undermines our intellect, go look at the political discourse right now. The shrieking harpies in the streets in the United States are a perfect example of this. Experience can be understood as the intensity in the sentiment, and it adds absolutely nothing to the sentiment. The more intense it is, the more it is sentimental. Immanence, or vital immanence as it is often called, forces us to ask a basic question. Does this leave God and man distinct from each other, or not? If it does, why reject external revelation? If not, how is this not pantheism? Pantheism says that the material world is God. Pan in Greek means everything. Theos means God. The Christians hold, of course, that God the Creator is distinct from the world he made. God is not the world. In the Christian worldview, the world is in time. God is eternal, the supreme first cause of all creatures. God exists outside of time. God exists outside of the world. Pius X turns his attention to the causes of modernism. The remote causes, he says, are curiosity and pride. Curiosity is the desire for novelty, new things, change. Curiosity is at the root of the progressivism. More important is pride, which always blinds the soul. Pride, says Pope St. Pius X, sits in modernism as in its own house. In them, pride says, we are not as the rest of men. We are the scholars, the experts, the ones who know. Pride rouses in them disobedience and complete disrespect for authority. Pride is the other half of the root of the progressive. Thus, modernism could also be called progressivism. It is indistinguishable from the cancer that eats at the moral fabric of society today. Modernism and progressivism both say that today we know better than those who came before. The chief intellectual cause of modernism, he says, is ignorance. Ignorance of scholasticism and church tradition. And in this they have succeeded admirably. Today we see that most Catholics treat the church as if it had no history prior to the Second Vatican Council, save for the few saints that the modernists promote and the crimes they like to throw in our face. They promote ignorance, their philosophy is vapid and weak, and when exposed to Aquinas and Augustine, modernism collapses like a house of cards. Thus we see Thomistic philosophy eliminated as the philosophy of the church, only to be replaced by the likes of Rahner, Desjardins, and other heretics and suspected heretics. They seek to bring to contempt traditional philosophy and theology, including the authority of the Church Fathers and sacred tradition, and even the magisterium itself. They wage total and constant war, using writings, editorial positions, teaching positions in universities and seminaries, and now positions of authority within the hierarchy that have led to their winning the young with the glamour of their novelties, dismissing those who oppose them as ignorant, stubborn, and out of date, characterizing those of us who hang on to tradition as Neo-Pelagian. Vital to understanding modernism is the relativism inherent to the system of not only thought, but of governance. John Venarri explains this when talking about Pope Francis and the modernism he's spreading in his supposed reforms of the church. The full video of John's speech is up at Vox Catholica YouTube channel. There's a link in the description. And while you're over there, give him a subscription and support Catholic apostolates.
Back to collegiality and synodality. They want to give national or local bishops' conference greater autonomy. Many reasons for doing this. One of them is for the sake of ecumenism. Now, John Paul II, in Ut Unum Sint, he did promise a reformation of the papacy along the lines of ecumenism, so it can be done, right? They could argue that. Also, they argue that we can't really make any ecumenical progress when we still have the Pope acting like the centrist monarch. They're not going to take us seriously. So for the sake of ecumenism, they want this new approach to the papacy. And here's Cardinal Ras. Here he is. You know, I like to say that the girl sitting on my lap, okay, you would think, I mean, if I said, no, I'm not changing the doctrine. I'm just proposing a reconciled infidelity, a reconciled diversity. This is how Cardinal Casper talks. When he's talking about giving all these local churches, national churches, greater autonomy, here's what he says. The ultimate aim is not a uniformed, The ultimate aim is not a uniformed, united church, but a church of reconciled diversity. Okay, we have yet another new term. Reconciled diversity, which means this thinking and the principle of non-contradiction are not on speaking terms. Okay? Reconciled infidelity, reconciled diversity. And this, unfortunately, is one of Archbishop Bergoglio's, Cardinal Bergoglio's, Pope Francis's favorite terms. In reference to ecumenism, that's how he talks. He tells a group of Pentecostals, Protestant Pentecostals, that he's interested in reconciled diversity, that he is interested in, he says, I am not looking to convert you, I'm looking that we just meet in the middle, okay? Now, Bergoglio's mind in this way is one with the St. Gallen group and Archbishop Quinn. Now, I have mentioned Bergoglio's unqualified praise of Martini and his support of Martini's program, but also there's Archbishop Quinn. Now, Quinn, in his 1999 book, The Reform of the Papacy, He called for greater collegiality and synodality along the lines of Cardinal Martini. He called for a greater decentralization of the church's governance. He called for a method of choosing bishops that's more like that of the Anglicans and the Schismatic Orthodox. He denounced the Curia as a barrier between the Pope and the rest of the bishops. Sound familiar? Okay. He called for more self-government and regional patriarchs who will appoint their own bishops and also decide liturgical questions. He calls for more decentralization, more horizontal communications, more internalization, and greater participation of laymen, particularly women, in decision-making offices in the Curia. Okay? That's what he called for. And just before the cardinals went into the 2013 conclave, less than 2 years ago, that elected Bergoglio as Pope, Cardinal Bergoglio happened to bump into Archbishop Quinn outside of a coffee shop in Rome. And Bergoglio said to Quinn, this is a direct quote, "I've read your book, and I am hoping what it proposes will be implemented." Okay, I'll say it again. Bergoglio said to Quinn, "I've read your book, and I'm hoping what it proposes is implemented." And Quinn himself told the story at a conference in St. Louis in June 2014. We are looking at the complete dismantling now, the complete fragmentation of unity. Because in his first apostolic exhortation, whatever it's called, Evangelium Gaudium, Francis signaled his intention to give bishops' conferences, listen to this, genuine doctrinal authority. The final word will not be Rome. The final word will be Timothy Dolan in his group, or Cardinal Marx in his group. See, this is the fragmentation of the universal church. Doctrine will be officially different from country to country. It's the way it has to work out. And they will do to doctrine what Vatican II did to the Mass. Everywhere you go, it's different. This opens the door for national churches that could be cut loose from the faith forever. England has never come back. It is 5 centuries later. But none of this matters to Casper or to Bergoglio because they're all hepped up on what they see as this new reconciled diversity. So, Cardinal Marx, the final thing I'm going to say is we've read about Cardinal Marx, who has said the German church governs itself. We're not a subsidiary of Rome. He knows Bergoglio's thinking. He knows this is what the structure is going to be, and he's just stepping forward first. Here's what he said just a couple days ago. We are not subsidiaries of Rome. Head of the Bishops' Conference in Germany. We are not subsidiaries of Rome. Each conference of bishops is responsible for the pastoral care in its culture, okay, the periphery defining, and must, as its most proper task, we cannot wait for a synod to tell us how we're going to have to shape pastoral care for marriage and the family. Okay, and this is one of the men on Bergoglio's cardinal, eight-man cardinal group to reform, I think deform, the Curia.
Thus, we see the deconstruction of the universal church itself. The goal is a transformation of Catholicism into a confederation of churches. This is Lutheranism, but with the Eucharist. Unless they dismantle the doctrines of the church on the local level, since Pope Francis seems to have the intention of giving that authority to the local bishops. Pope St. Pius X proposed harsh remedies as he directed the bishops of the world, as well as superiors and professors of theology, to exercise utmost diligence in promoting all sound studies, especially the study of scholastic philosophy with St. Thomas Aquinas as guide. Thomism is the cure, at least philosophically. He bids them to be vigilant in choosing who gets to teach, who enters holy orders, and in what is published, as well as what is taught in seminaries and in Catholic schools, as well as other remedies. The Holy Father capped this with an oath against modernism in 1910, to which all were mandated to take before ordination and induction as parish priest, and other significant posts. He was also to found in Rome the Biblical Institute for Scripture Studies to defend against modernist heresies. Pope St. Pius X ended his landmark but otherwise forgotten encyclical with an appeal to Christ, to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and for faithfulness broadly. By now, this should seem familiar. This is the world we live in today. The terms the modernists promoted 100 years ago are the terms we blanch at now. Renewal, symbol, experience. Experience is revelation. The Easter experiences of the apostles. The consciousness of the early Christians. Accompaniment. And teachings that have not been received. And, my favorite, going out to the peripheries. The immediate aftermath was interesting. After Pascendi, a small few who persisted in their dissent were excommunicated. This was about 30 priests or so who ended up leaving the church, but many others professed to submit and return to Catholic truth. Perhaps the Pope's letter was a mirror in which they finally saw themselves, but perhaps they merely kept their views close to the chest. The end result was about 50 years of time bought for the church, and an illusion of unity, clarity, and growth in understanding the reality of the situation. But then the crisis in the church emerged. It did not emerge in 2002, like many suggest, or in the summer of sin that we just endured. No, it emerged in the years leading to the Second Vatican Council, with the first cases of priests abusing children being reported in the US and Ireland in the 1940s, and being quietly covered up. It emerged with the lifting of the excommunications on the followers of Desjardins and the acceptance of Karl Rahner as a great theologian. And it took full force when Pope John XXIII called the Second Vatican Council. Whenever a crisis in the church emerges, then, often of their own creation, the modernists propose reforms. By now you're familiar with the so-called reforms at the council. A revised liturgy that was allegedly more relevant to the world. Ecumenicalism, a focus on the material world and material experiences. The social teaching of the church received a facelift that removed the focus of the spiritual combined with the material into a greater and greater focus on material solutions to world problems, to such a degree that in Laudato Si we are treated to a treatise on the need for some form of global governance in order to address largely overblown climate concerns. And then there's the situation at the Synod today, with renewed talks of revising the liturgy, changing the timeless teachings of the church regarding sexual morality, and even talks recently of allowing Protestants to receive Holy Communion at the Mass. Modernism is in the air we breathe in the church today, but there are signs of a return to tradition. If you look around at the typical parish that celebrates what they call the ordinary form of the Mass, you'll see an aging crowd with few young children, while if you attend a Latin Mass with the FSSP, the SSPX, the Institute of Christ the King, or any other traditional society, you will see young families by the score. You'll see vocations reports that show seminary enrollment and ordinations that dwarf even the healthiest of dioceses in the US and Europe. Modernism is dying a slow death, and we have Christ to thank for that. If you like videos like this, like and share this video and subscribe, and click that notification bell below. I can be found on Twitter and Facebook, with links in the description. For Return to Tradition, I'm Anthony Stein. Ave Maria.